artistic practices needed to mutate, to transform in the context of these fundamental realities out there in the world. She said, Teddy, she said to me in a conversation, I think it is time to return Duchamp's urinal to the bathroom, she said. And in fact, for me, it was a compelling statement as well, suggesting the need at this very moment to find new functional, and that word I would like to emphasize, even though it has been a forbidden word for architecture and art, a more functional relationship between research, artistic research, but we would maybe, through the concepts that you were introduced tonight, the conceptualization, the interpretation of that reality fundamentally, a more functional relationship between artistic research, artistic intervention in the territory, and the construction not only of the city, but of new conceptions of citizenship. That was a fundamental issue. And finally, the last and most compelling of the inspirations came not from a philosopher, not from a writer, from an artist. It came, in fact, from the commander-in-chief of the war in Iraq a few years ago, General Petraeus, who, when sent by the Bush administration to Iraq to sort of seemingly fix a mess, he came back and gave his first address to Congress, his report of what he saw on the ground. And he said, one of the first things that he said to Congress was, the contemporary soldier needs to transform. He cannot be anymore this robot-like figure, armed and with every gadget, every technological gadget that allows the military to control the war from a distance by the mere pressing of the button. But in fact, he said, this soldier needs to transform into a social worker, he said, in fact, into a social worker, an anthropologist, and versed in many languages. Because, he said, the war was not fought or controlled from a distance. At the end, it was fought on the ground, inside neighborhoods, out of social networks, familial relationships, and so on. Interesting, I said to myself, if the contemporary soldier has or needs to transform, why can't we as artists and as architects to rethink the sites of intervention somehow, and to also begin to maybe perform differently? That does not mean that we have to be social workers as artists or anthropologists, but maybe what he was suggesting, we need to borrow the procedures of the anthropologist, of the social worker, and so on. This exchange of ways of acting, of proceeding, processes, ultimately was in one of your columns, okay, are ways to redefine the tension between representation and power and the construction of culture itself. I think it begins to make sense when these columns begin to blur and cross their own neat categorizations. Finally, I think out of this rumination, let's say this meditation on what General Petraeus said, is that forever the avant-garde in the context of art, we can call it maybe loosely the historic avant-garde, has depended on a critical distance from the institutions of power, to criticize them from outside. I think that we are seeing an expanded model of practices at this very moment when instead of a critical distance, we are talking about a critical proximity, not only to the institutions, but to the vectors, the forces, the conditions that are imprinted in the territory, the conditions of power that are redefined in our very institutions. How to reobserve what is out there. How do we do that as artists? To redefine our own procedures. For me, it has been essential to create this, or to produce this very critical proximity, to radicalize the local, as I call it in my own context, which is the Tijuana-San Diego border condition. This is a figure ground map of the border. What is white is built, what is black is empty space. Usually urbanists do the opposite. White is empty space, black is the buildings. But I like to reverse it because I'm focusing on the empty spaces as the sites for new architectures, new cultural, social relationships. But nevertheless, the image allows the white to crash against the black of San Diego in this case, suggesting and dramatizing how the density of Tijuana crashes against the wall. One city pushing against the other. And you can see the blue line of how the Colorado River enters in one of its tributaries, enters into Mexico and exits again into San Diego on the north. It's a very strange situation of how the river, goes across this transnational border. I will get to that later. One issue for me again has been how to reobserve this territory. By unearthing the conditions that shape it, I am able to redefine the rhythms of globalization in some way. The return to the local is something that has been talked about already for a long time, in order to reconceive the abstraction that has been given to us about globalization. Everything that is happening globally is already being reproduced in our backyard, but yet we have thought that just looking at our backyard is provincial. I think we need to reobserve that in order to reconfigure these conditions. So I decided, while much of my work, and there's not much time here to elaborate on that, has focused on the neighborhoods across that line to really understand the communities. What is happening to those communities on both sides of the border? So usually the attention is just on the border, right? Homeland security, surveillance, and so on. Never about the flows, the social, economic, cultural flows that transgress that border. So I've been interested in understanding that parallel to the borderline. Recently, though, I did a cross-section. I did the opposite. Instead of understanding the parallel conditions to the border, I cut a transversal section between San Diego and Tijuana, literally almost like that red line. And I called it 60 linear miles of transborder conflict. And it became a photographic essay, in a sense, beginning 30 miles deep into San Diego, 30 miles deep into Tijuana, picking up along those 60 linear miles across both cities, environments where artificial and natural ecologies collide, where conditions of top-down urbanization begin to clash with bottom-up social or ecological networks and so on. So physically captured along the 60 linear miles, almost sequential, those environments where the imprint, not only of globalization, but of power itself, of the institutions, is physicalized, is manifested physically. So if we were to begin 30 miles deep into Tijuana, into San Diego, beginning north, moving from north to south, we would find in the edges of San Diego the flattening of the topography of the edges of the city, where these beautiful canyons are being flattened so that developers can install on them the very cheap recipes of these master plan gated communities. The conflict between the top-down forces of development and the natural topography. Let's say that's one first conflict. Again, a series of conflicts across this transborder territory. The conflict between large freeway infrastructure and the watershed, as in Southern California, you can imagine the large freeway ecology clashes with the natural hydrology of the land, as these coastal freeways collide with the watershed as it descends to the Pacific Ocean. The conflict between gated communities and everyday life, or as Rebecca Solnit called it, the apartheid of social life in these communities. The conflict between military bases and environmental zones. It's interesting to imagine that the only places where the otherwise continuous urbanization from Los Angeles to Ensenada, Baja California, is interrupted is where the military bases are located, coinciding with environmental zones. And so this is strange, again, alliance between militarization and urbanization. The conflict between formal and informal urbanisms and economies as neighborhoods in San Diego begin to transform out of how immigrants are retrofitting them, and we'll get to that in a moment. We reach the border, and of course the conflict between two cities that repel each other, that are indifferent to each other. As soon as we cross the border, we find the Tijuana River as it enters into San Diego again after moving through the city of Tijuana, opens the border wall, the actual metal wall, and this large channelized river enters into what becomes the Tijuana River estuary, an environmentally protected zone. But that almost tangential crossing between the border, the political, and the river and the border collide. The conflict between informal and natural ecologies as the slums of Tijuana also encroach into the natural networks or systems. The conflict between factories, maquiladoras, and emergency housing in the edges of Tijuana. The conflict between density and sprawl in Tijuana as Tijuana is importing the cheap, homogeneous recipes of suburbanization of San Diego the conflict at the end of this 60 linear mile photographic cross-section of the territory, the most dramatic of all probably conflicts and collisions, the conflict between the natural and the political as the border wall, after traveling miles and miles in the Tijuana territory, finally sinks into the Pacific Ocean, creating this strange image, which is the one that we amplify in a 90-foot-long mural, just to really capture the drama of this wall, this fence, as it sinks into the Pacific Ocean. And this, again, juxtaposed with this horizon of local conflict across a series of collisions between natural and artificial ecologies. And this is what we hung in the Venice Biennale last summer in the US Pavilion. Imagine the opportunity to hang this as a facade of the US Pavilion, one of the most contested borders in the world, serving literally as the emblem of the need to search for artistic practices, architectural practices across the United States that were redefining their own procedures in the context, again, of conflict. And literally serving as a threshold to enter the exhibition. What a treat to be able to hang this wall 6 months before the Bush administration packed its bags and really rethink or open up the promise, as he's been opened up in recent months, even though that's questionable already, the need to redefine the very institutions that construct the city. When we get to this level of detail, the territory then takes a very different configuration. And for me, it has been essential to, again, approximate the very nature of these conflicts. In other words, to question, almost like a kind of CSI, we would call it, of urbanism. What produced the conflict in the first place? What are the conditions that produce the crisis that we are living across the board?